Minister, to put it very simply and bluntly, energy poverty is going to kill several thousand of our most vulnerable citizens this winter. Climate action, so-called, in the form of the carbon tax, is going to kill many thousands of our most vulnerable and elderly citizens this winter unless you do something about it. And that is what we are appealing for you to do. We've just come out, or we are edging our way out, of a public health emergency where the government, in order to prevent deaths from COVID-19, 5,000 people of whom died tragically as a result of that pandemic and that public health emergency, prompted the government to spend an additional €24 billion in order to prevent, rightly, to prevent deaths in a public health emergency. Now, our motion is asserting that this is a public health emergency in exactly the same way as COVID-19 was a public health emergency and required an unprecedented response in order to prevent unnecessary and needless deaths of the vulnerable. This is a public health emergency. But it's not one that is confined to 1 year. It is an ongoing public health emergency where the sick, the elderly, the older people, poorer people die as a result of the lack of resources that they have in order to heat their homes. And the government has a responsibility to recognise that public health emergency in the same way as they recognised the COVID emergency, and to make unprecedented efforts in order to ensure unnecessary and needless deaths among our older and more vulnerable and poorer sections of our society. And those who are vulnerable are not a small cohort. St Vincent de Paul estimate 19%, almost 1/5 of our entire population, are cutting back on the use of electricity and heating because they can't afford it. And some of those people die as a result. Now those deaths and that hardship and suffering that those who have to turn down the heat and shiver in the cold this winter is the government's responsibility. It is something you can address, but if your counter-motion to our motion is an indication of your response to this, you are clearly not going to address. You're going to allow unnecessary deaths to continue. You're going to fail to recognise that this is a public health emergency, and you are going to allow the vulnerable, the poor and the elderly to suffer, and some of them to die, because you won't recognise how serious it is. And this is a year-on-year public health emergency. But now it has got worse, very substantially worse, and one has to fear, therefore, what will be the potential casualties at the end of the winter season if the government doesn't act, when we are talking about people getting 2, 3 and 4 energy price hikes over the last year, up to €400–500 a year in additional costs for electricity and heating. And overwhelmingly, the cost and the burden of those increases are going to fall on the people who have the least ability to do anything about it. Not only because they are on low incomes, but of course the people who are on low incomes are also disproportionately concentrated in houses where the insulation is extremely poor, where the quality of housing is very poor, and where they have to use disproportionate amounts of energy and heating in order to keep their houses warm. In the case of social housing tenants, they have no control at all over the level of insulation of their homes, because it is up to the local authority and the government to retrofit their homes. And I have to say, Minister, it is nauseating to hear the government in their counter-motion and in your speech suggest that the retrofit programme is anything other than pitiful. Pitiful. Last year, the target, Deputy Murphy, in our motion is incorrect. because they're too generous in what you said you were trying to meet. The revised estimates for 2021 showed only €25 million put into the social housing retrofit programme, and the target was 1,670 retrofits, which was not met. It had to be revised down, I think once or twice during the course of the year, because the government and local authorities have spectacularly failed to meet that target. And that's against a total social housing stock of 137,000. Even in the much lauded and trumpeted National Development Plan, the government is only proposing to retrofit 1/4 of the entire social housing stock by 2030. 37,000 homes, as against a housing stock of 137,000. So 3/4 of those who are in social housing will not have their homes retrofitted at the end of the National Development Plan. The amount of investment is pathetic. In terms of the private grants available for private homeowners, the maximum grant you can get is just under €15,000. And not surprisingly, the SEAI's targets for home retrofits were not met either, because of course the actual cost of retrofitting your home is anywhere between 35,000 and up to 70,000 if you want to get to a BER A rating. So the government is failing spectacular and is demonstrating no willingness to actually implement the just transition, which means not unloading the cost of carbon taxes and of climate measures on the people who cannot afford to do it. If you're rich, of course you can retrofit your home. You can manage 70,000. But if you're in social housing, if you're a low-paid worker, if you're a pensioner, how on earth are you going to get 35,000 or 70,000 to retrofit your home when the grants available are about 15,000? You can't do it. You cannot do it. So we need to dramatically increase the investment. And by the way, that would save millions. I haven't got time to set it out. Our proposal in the forthcoming budget is to do 50,000 homes per year, moving up to 100,000, but the savings are absolutely dramatic. We would save about €206 million a year for every 50,000 homes that we retrofit. But in the meantime, until the government steps up to the mark in terms of retrofitting people's homes so they can reduce their heating and energy use, it is absolutely nothing short of punishment to impose further increases in the carbon tax on people who have no control of the level of heat and energy they have to use in their homes to keep themselves warm and in some cases to keep themselves alive. Okay, so it is criminal to continue to impose carbon taxes on these people. We should not only defer the carbon tax increase, we should reverse. We think we should abolish the carbon tax because it is fundamentally regressive. But if you're not willing to impose it, let me be clear, impose it on the real big polluters, the big agri-beef barons, the big corporations that are responsible for huge amounts of emissions. Impose the taxes on them. Do not impose them on the poor, on the pensioners, on the sick and the vulnerable, which is what you are proposing to do with this carbon tax increase. And again, if you recognise there was an emergency in COVID-19 and you took unprecedented measures and state intervention, levels of state intervention, unprecedented, to match the public health emergency, by God, it is justified to declare an emergency in energy costs and energy supply, and you have the legal mechanisms to do it, to impose maximum unit prices on energy and electricity. Why won't you do it? It is unconscionable if you refuse to do it, Minister. So I seriously ask the government, think again about what you're doing. Have you learned anything from the COVID pandemic about the importance of public health, about we're all in it together? Or are we seriously going to allow continue the obscenity and the scandal of the poor, the vulnerable, the elderly and the sick to die because of lack of heating in their homes and the financial pressures that your government is willing to impose on them through the carbon taxes and through absolutely obscene levels of energy prices by an energy sector that has become completely consumed by profit? And indeed, where the supplies of energy and the price of energy is being driven up by the greed of entities like the big IT companies wanting to build data centres, which you want to facilitate, and they are actually driving up the prices and reducing the level of energy that is available. It shows your priorities. The big multinationals come first, but the sick, the elderly, the poor and the vulnerable will die as a consequence. I appeal to you, withdraw your amendment and support the measures we are proposing in this motion.
Thank you.